The wind moved through Bitterroot Valley, like something alive, long, low, and restless. It pressed against the cabin walls, whispered through the pine needles, and carried with it the bite of a storm building over the ridge. Louisa Harlow stood at the window, one hand on the frost-crusted sill, and watched the first flakes drift down. The horses had been brought in. The tools were hung. There was nothing left to do but wait out whatever the mountains decided to send her way. She'd lived alone out here for 5 winters now. The valley didn't mind solitude. It rewarded it. The creek, frozen to a vein of dull glass, ran behind the barn, and the nearest neighbor was half a day's ride south. Some days Louisa could go from dawn to dusk without hearing her own name, and that was fine by her. The world had taken enough. She'd learned to keep quiet and let it have what it wanted. By dusk, the wind began to scream. Snow came in hard, sideways, 1,000 tiny knives against the window pane. Louisa added another log to the fire and crouched by the hearth, rubbing her hands together. The flame threw her shadow across the floorboards, thin, upright, like a woman holding herself together through habit rather than faith. She was lifting the kettle from the hook when something banged against the door. Not the wind, not the shifting wood, a real knock, sharp and human. She froze. Out here, a knock after dark could mean anything. Drifters, men from town, trouble wearing a friendly face. Louisa reached for the rifle leaning beside the door. "Who's there?" she called. A voice came through the storm, high and trembling. "Louisa, please, it's me." Her stomach clenched. That voice hadn't touched her ears in 7 years. She drew back the bolt and swung the door open. Snow whirled in, along with a shape bent against the wind, a woman. Her hair matted, cheeks raw, clutching something bundled in her arms. For a heartbeat, Louisa didn't recognize her. Then memory struck like lightning through the dark. "Millie," she whispered. Her sister stumbled forward, half collapsing inside. The bundle in her arms gave a faint cry, thin and pitiful. "Please," Millie gasped, her lips cracked and blue. "She's freezing." Louisa shut the door hard against the storm and pulled her sister toward the fire. The baby's face was a pale rose beneath layers of wet cloth. Louisa stripped off the outer wraps, found the small body still warm, thank God. She laid the baby close to the fire, rubbing tiny hands between her palms until the crying grew stronger. "Lord have mercy," Louisa muttered. "What in God's name are you doing out here in this weather?" Millie sank onto the floor, her breath ragged. I didn't have anywhere else to go." Louisa looked at her, really looked. Millie's hair was tangled, her coat threadbare, and her boots near torn through. Beneath the grime, she still had that same soft mouth, the same eyes that once sparkled with mischief when she'd run off with that miner from Butte. Louisa felt old suddenly, older than her 35 years. "How long you been traveling?" she asked. 3 days, Millie whispered. "The coach dropped us in Derby. I walked from there." "That's 20 miles, Millie." "I know." Her eyes glistened in the firelight. "He's gone, Louisa. Jack's gone. The mine caved in 2 months back." Louisa exhaled slowly. So that was the reason. Grief had driven more people into these mountains than gold ever did. "What's her name?" Louisa asked, nodding at the baby. "Rose." Millie said it like a prayer, touching the child's cheek. "She's 2 months old." Rose fussed softly, eyes shut tight, lips searching. Louisa poured warm milk from the kettle into a small cup, dipped her finger, and brushed it along the baby's lips until she latched. The sound of quiet suckling filled the room, a fragile, living sound that pushed back the storm outside. For a while, neither woman spoke. Louisa added another log, the crackle of sap breaking the silence. The storm hit the cabin in hard gusts, and the old beams shuddered, but the fire held steady. Finally, Millie said, I didn't know where else to go. I thought maybe you could forgive me." Louisa turned her gaze to the flames. "Forgive you for what? For leaving? For not writing? For all of it?" Louisa felt the words settle like snow on her shoulders, soft, heavy, and hard to shake off. She wanted to say she'd stopped caring years ago, but that would be a lie. Every winter, some part of her waited for a letter that never came. "Let's get you dry," she said instead, standing. "We'll talk in the morning." Millie nodded, eyes wet. "Thank you, Louisa, truly." Louisa fetched a quilt and draped it over her sister's shoulders, then another over the baby. She watched them a long time, sitting together by the fire, the child stirring faintly, Millie whispering something too low to hear. The sight stirred something in Louisa's chest, something she'd locked away when her own heart had broken years back. Outside, the wind roared like a living thing. Snow piled high against the door. The world had shrunk to the size of one room, one fire, and the faint rhythm of a child breathing. Sometime near midnight, when Millie and the baby finally slept, Louisa stepped to the window. The glass had frosted over, but she could see faint movement beyond the barn, a flicker, a shadow passing through the white. Her hand went instinctively to the rifle. Nothing but wind, she told herself. Maybe a stray elk. Maybe her mind. But when she looked again, she saw tracks, fresh ones, leading from the tree line toward the creek. Large, firm steps, not animal. A man's. Louisa's pulse quickened. No one sane traveled Bitterroot at night, not in a storm like this. Whoever he was, he had reason to hide or to hunt. She banked the fire low, set the rifle by her bed, and listened to the house settle. The baby whimpered once and went quiet again. For a long time Louisa lay awake, counting the gusts, waiting for another sound, a knock, a step, a voice. None came. By morning the storm had smothered the valley in white silence. Snow lay knee-deep against the door, and the world beyond had vanished. Louisa rose, stiff and hollow-eyed, and fed the fire back to life. Millie still slept, the baby curled against her breast. They looked small and fragile, two strangers wrapped in the same quilt of need. Louisa filled the kettle, stepped outside, and shoveled a path to the well. The cold hit like a slap, sharp and clean. She breathed it in, watched the vapor rise from her lips. The air smelled of pine and smoke and something else. Blood, faint but real. Near the barn door lay a dark streak where snow had melted. A trail, half covered by the night's fall, led down toward the creek. Louisa knelt, touched the snow. It was red, not fresh, but not old either. God help us, she murmured. Somewhere out there, in the woods where the creek wound through drifts of white, someone had died and kept walking. She straightened, rifle in hand, and scanned the tree line. For a moment, nothing. Then far off, a figure moved between the pines, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a dark-hide coat. He walked slow, careful, favoring one arm. Even from a distance, she could see the stain spreading across his sleeve. He looked up, met her eyes. Then the world tilted. He stumbled, fell to one knee, and didn't rise again. Louisa hesitated only a breath before striding forward, boots crunching through snow. The cold bit deep, but the part of her that had learned to fear the unknown stayed behind on the porch. She reached the man's side, knelt, and saw the color of his skin beneath the frost bronze, wind-burned, with the high cheekbones and dark hair of an Apache. He was still breathing, faint but steady. His eyes fluttered open, met hers. In that single heartbeat, something unspoken passed between them. Surprise, pain, and a strange recognition neither could name. Louisa swallowed hard. "Can you hear me?" He tried to speak, but only managed a whisper. "Fire," he said, "please." The word came out like smoke. Louisa looked back toward the cabin, toward the small flame still alive in the hearth. the sleeping baby, the sister she'd just begun to forgive. She took a breath, then slid her arm beneath the stranger's shoulders. "All right," she murmured. "Let's get you warm." The wind rose again as she half dragged, half carried him toward the cabin. Snow closed behind them, covering the trail until nothing remained but white silence. When Louisa dragged him inside, the door slammed behind them, and the wind howled like something shut out against its will. Millie jolted awake, clutching the baby. The firelight threw wild shadows as Louisa staggered under the stranger's weight. Snow and blood streaked the floor. "Good Lord! Who is that?" Millie gasped. Louisa didn't answer at first. She eased the man down onto the rug beside the hearth. His skin was cold, his coat stiff with frozen blood. When she peeled it back, she saw a wound high on his left shoulder, a long tear that looked like it had been cut by a knife or a sharp bit of metal. "He's hurt bad," Louisa said. "I found him out by the creek." Millie's voice trembled. "You brought him in?" "Louisa, he's Apache. I know what he is." "Then you know what they've done. You remember what?" Louisa cut her off, her tone even but sharp. "He's a man, Millie. He's bleeding same as any other. You want me to leave him out there to die?" Millie said nothing. The baby began to cry again, as if the storm had found its way into the child's lungs. Louisa knelt by the wounded man and unwrapped a strip of linen from her sewing box. His breath was shallow, each inhale trembling through his chest. She'd seen enough wounds to know he wouldn't last the day without help. When she poured hot water into a basin, steam rose, carrying the scent of pine resin and iron. She cleaned the gash, worked the blood away until she could see the foot beneath deep, but not fatal if it didn't fester. He didn't flinch. His eyes were half open, dark as the bark of wet spruce, following her face like a man half lost between worlds. "What's your name?" she asked quietly. He blinked slow. His lips barely moved. "Talon." She repeated it softly. "Talon." He nodded once, then his gaze drifted to the baby, who had quieted in Millie's arms. His expression changed just slightly, a shadow of something tender crossing the pain. He murmured a word Louisa didn't recognize, something in Apache that sounded like a prayer. When she finished binding his shoulder, she fetched a blanket from her bed and laid it over him. His body shook once, then went still. The wind outside rattled the shutters, but inside the cabin, a fragile calm settled. Millie stood by the wall, holding Rose close. "He shouldn't be here," she whispered. "If anyone from town finds out, they'll think we've lost our sense." Louisa turned. "Nobody from town's coming through this snow. And if they do, they'll answer to me." Millie pressed her lips tight, but said no more. By nightfall, the storm eased to a low hum. Louisa sat by the hearth, mending a tear in her sleeve, the rifle propped within reach. Talon slept, his face half in shadow. Every now and then, he muttered something in his own tongue. Louisa couldn't tell if it was pain or memory speaking. Once, his hand jerked up as if to ward off a blow, and she caught his wrist before he hurt himself. "It's all right," she said softly. "You're safe here." His eyes fluttered open. For a moment, he didn't seem to know where he was. Then he looked at her hand still holding his. The ghost of a smile touched his mouth. "You shouldn't trust me," he said in a hoarse whisper. Louisa met his gaze. "You're not in shape to do much harm." He almost laughed, then grimaced from the pain. "Still, you don't know who I am." "Don't matter tonight," she said, releasing his wrist. "Tonight, you're just another soul trying to stay alive." He looked at her for a long moment, as though testing her words against some old wound inside himself. Then he nodded faintly and drifted back into sleep. Morning came pale and brittle. Snow hung from the roof, like the teeth of an old animal. Louisa opened the door a crack. The air that came in was clean and sharp. The valley was nothing but white silence again, The world reset overnight. When she came back in, Millie was feeding Rose with a spoon of warm milk. The baby kicked weakly but drank. Talon stirred on the floor, eyes opening to the morning light. "Where am I?" he asked. "Bitterroot Valley," Louisa said, handing him a tin cup of water. "My land! You nearly froze to death." He drank slow, each swallow tight with pain. "You should have left me where I fell." "Maybe," she said, "but I didn't." He looked around the small cabin, the worn table, the cracked window, the scent of pine smoke, and his gaze lingered on the baby again. "That your child?" Louisa shook her head. "My sister's." Millie stiffened but said nothing. Talon's eyes softened. "She's strong," he murmured. "She'll live." Louisa frowned slightly. "You a doctor too?" "No, just someone who's seen too many die young." There was a quiet that followed, a kind of understanding that didn't need to be spoken. Outside, the wind had gone still. The only sound was the low crackle of the fire and Rose's small breaths. By midday, Talon tried to stand. Louisa helped him up, and he swayed but stayed upright. "You'll tear that wound if you push it," she warned. "I can't stay here," he said. "The storm will clear, and men may come looking." "What men?" she asked. He hesitated. "Hunters. Not after me, but I crossed their path. They think I'm with the raiders who hit a freight line last week." Louisa folded her arms. "You running from the law?" "No," he said, "from fools who think they are." She studied him. There was no panic in his eyes, no guilt either, only exhaustion, and that deep-set weariness she recognized in herself. A man carrying too many ghosts. "Well, you can't walk out in that snow," she said finally. "You'll stay until you can ride, and that's that." Talon gave a faint nod. "You have the spirit of a war chief," he said almost to himself. Louisa snorted. "I've been called worse." That earned her a real smile. It was quick, small, but it changed his whole face, made him look younger, almost gentle. Millie saw it too, and she didn't like it. When Louisa went to fetch more firewood from the shed, Millie followed her out. "You can't let him stay," she hissed. "What if he brings trouble? What if he's lying?" Louisa dropped a lug into the crook of her arm. "Maybe he is. Maybe he ain't. But until he can walk out on his own, he stays." "Louisa, you don't understand these people." Louisa turned, eyes hard. "These people. He's a man, Millie. He's bled for something. I can see it. Same as I see it in you. In me, we've all got our scars." Millie's mouth trembled. She started to speak, then shook her head and went back inside. That evening, after Rose had fallen asleep and Millie dozed by the wall, Louisa sat by the fire with her mending. Talon lay awake, watching the flames dance. The storm outside had softened to a whisper, snow falling straight and slow like ash. "Your sister," he said quietly. "She fears me." "She fears most things," Louisa replied. "She's had reason." "And you?" Louisa looked up from her stitching. "I don't know yet." He nodded as though that was answer enough. A long silence settled between them, the kind that felt less like distance and more like space to breathe. After a while he said, "There's a word in my tongue, tada. It means when fire and wind meet, neither wins. They make smoke that carries far. That's what this storm feels like." Louisa smiled faintly. "You got poetry for everything?" "No," he said, eyes glinting in the firelight. "Only for what might save me." She met his gaze then, steady, and for a moment the wind outside, the gold, the world, all of it fell away. There was only the crackle of the hearth, and two people who didn't quite trust each other, yet had already staked their survival on the other's mercy. When Louisa finally rose to bank the fire, Talon's eyes were still open. "Sleep," she told him. He closed them, murmuring something soft, a line of words she didn't understand but felt in her voice. It sounded like gratitude, or maybe a promise. Louisa blew out the lamp and crawled into her bed. The last thing she heard before sleep took her was the quiet rhythm of his breath mingling with the hiss of the dying storm. Somewhere in the dark, beneath the weight of snow, the valley listened and held its secrets close. The storm passed, but winter held its grip. For days, the snow outside gleamed like iron under a pale sun, and the world seemed carved from glass. The drifts reached the fence line, and the only sound was the steady drip of meltwater from the eaves when the sun climbed high enough to soften the edges. Inside, life settled into a fragile rhythm. Louisa rose before dawn to light the fire and stir the coals, her breath a thin cloud in the cold air. Talon, though still weak, began to move about, his steps slow but steady. He chopped small pieces of kindling, mended the broken latch on the barn, and kept the horses watered. Millie watched him warily, as if any moment he might vanish or turn on them. But he didn't. He worked without complaint, never asking for more than his share of food or rest. At night, when the snow glowed blue through the window, he sat near the hearth, carving bits of wood into small shapes, birds, horses, a single feather. Louisa found herself watching him more than she cared to admit. There was something careful in the way he moved, a kind of reverence she hadn't seen in a man since before her life had gone cold. He wasted nothing, not a scrap of food, not a word, not a breath. One morning, she came in from the barn with frost on her lashes and found him boiling willow bark in a small pot. The scent was sharp, bitter. "What's that for?" she asked. "Child's fever," he said, glancing toward the corner where Rose slept. "She breathes hard." Louisa's heart jumped. She crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt by the baby. Rose's skin was hot, her tiny chest rising too fast. Millie sat beside her, eyes wide with fear. "I didn't know what to do," Millie whispered. Talon poured the liquid into a cup, cooled it with a bit of snow, then dipped a clean cloth and touched it to the child's lips. "Let her taste it. Slow." Millie hesitated, then obeyed. Rose whimpered, then swallowed. After a few minutes, her breathing eased. The color began to return to her cheeks. Louisa let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "You knew what to do." Talon nodded. "My mother used to make it. Fever takes quickly in winter. You have to meet it halfway." Millie brushed tears from her face, whispering thanks, but Talon only shrugged. "No thanks needed. Just keep her warm." When Louisa looked at him again, something in her chest shifted, an old rusted hinge finally giving way. The days that followed softened around the edges. The wind still bit, but less cruelly. Talon and Louisa began to speak more, though their words came slow and measured. She told him about the land, how her father had built the first cabin here, how her mother died one spring when the river flooded. He listened with quiet patience, never interrupting, never turning her story into his own. In return, he told her of his childhood near the Gila River. His tribe had been pushed north after the soldiers came. He'd been a translator for a while, trying to keep peace, but there was no peace to keep. His wife and child died when the army burned a camp they mistook for raiders. Louisa said nothing for a long time after that. The only sound was the fire, snapping mufflingly. "I'm sorry," she said finally. Talon looked into the flames. "So am I." It wasn't a conversation so much as a confession, shared by 2 souls who knew the cost of silence. That night, when the cabin slept, Louisa found herself standing at the window, staring at the stars. They looked close enough to touch. She wondered if her father had stood in this same place years ago, feeling the same kind of loneliness that felt like a weight and a comfort all at once. Behind her, Talon stirred. "You don't sleep," he said quietly. "Too much noise in my head," she answered. He smiled faintly. "Then you're alive. The dead sleep easy." She almost laughed at that, a soft sound swallowed by the dark. "You always talk like that." when the night listens," he said. And somehow she believed him. By the third week, the snow began to thaw at the edges. The creek groaned beneath its crust, and sunlight spilled longer through the window. Talon's strength returned enough that he could lift the water pail without grimacing. He joined Louisa in the barn, mending the broken beams with quiet skill. One morning, he showed her how to braid rope from rawhide. His hands were sure, moving in steady rhythm. Louisa tried to follow, her fingers clumsy. "You pull too hard," he said gently. "It's the same with horses, or people. If you pull too hard, they break." She raised an eyebrow. "You calling me rough?" He smiled. "No, strong. There's a difference." The words hit her deeper than she expected. For the rest of the morning, she worked beside him, neither speaking much. But the silence was no longer empty, it was shared. Inside the cabin, Millie watched from the doorway, her face pale. She felt herself fading from her sister's world, as if the place that had been hers by blood now belonged to someone else. That night, when the moon hung low and red, she whispered to Louisa while Talon slept by the fire. "You shouldn't let him stay much longer," Millie said. "People talk." "People always talk," Louisa replied, her tone weary. "You don't understand. If the men from Butte come, they'll think he's helping me hide. They'll kill him." Louisa looked at her sister, at the fear twisting her features. "Then we'll face them together." Millie shook her head, tears glinting in the lamplight. "You don't know what I did, Louisa." Louisa waited, but Millie turned away. "Not tonight," she whispered. "Please." The next morning dawned cold and bright. Talon was outside splitting wood when Louisa brought him a cup of coffee. Steam rose between them. "You work too hard," she said. "It keeps the ghosts quiet," he answered. She studied his face in the sunlight, scarred, weathered, but calm. She realized she hadn't felt afraid of him in days, not once. "Maybe you could stay until spring," she said without meaning to. He looked at her, surprise flickering in his eyes. "You'd let me?" "I'd be a fool not to," she said. "There's more to fix around here than I've got years left to do." A smile tugged at his mouth, but he didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out one of the carvings he'd made, a small bird, its wings open, carved smooth from pine. He handed it to her. "It's a wren," he said. "They stay through winter. Small, but they don't leave." Louisa turned it over in her hand. "Why give it to me?" "Because you stayed too," he said simply. Her throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to say something that might match the quiet weight of that gift, but the words wouldn't come. So she only nodded, tucking the bird into her apron pocket. That evening, the clouds thickened again, heavy and gray. The wind carried a scent of iron and smoke. Louisa stood by the door, watching the horizon darken. Talon came up beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. "Another storm," he said. "Looks like." He hesitated, then said, "Sometimes the mountain keeps its storms longer than it should, like a heart that won't let go." Louisa turned toward him. Their eyes met in the dim light. For a heartbeat, the air between them felt charged not with fear, not with desire exactly, but with recognition. Two survivors finding the same heartbeat beneath different scars. Then the baby cried from inside, and the moment broke. Louisa stepped back. "I'd better see to her." Talon nodded, though his gaze lingered a second longer before he turned toward the barn. When Louisa picked up Rose, she felt the child's warmth against her chest, small and steady. Outside, through the small window, she could see Talon lighting a lantern in the dark. The wind lifted his hair, carrying sparks into the night. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the ache of old wounds, Louisa felt the faintest flicker of something she hadn't dared in years hope. Not the wild, burning kind that destroyed, but a small ember, glowing steady against the cold. and in the silence of Bitterroot Valley. That was enough to keep the fire alive. The thaw came with a strange sound, water running beneath ice, soft as breath under a blanket. For weeks the world had been silent. Now the valley whispered again. The creek stirred, the roof dripped, and the horses stomped restlessly in the barn. Louisa welcomed the noise. It meant life. But with life came what she feared most: movement on the trails. Strangers returning to the roads that winter had closed. One morning, while she and Talon split logs by the shed, the sharp echo of hooves rolled down from the ridge. 3 riders, silhouettes against the melting snow, moved slow but certain toward the cabin. Talon's head lifted. "You expecting company?" Louisa's stomach tightened. "No one rides out here for kindness." Millie stepped onto the porch, her face going white. She recognized one of them before they even drew close. "Louisa," she whispered, clutching the doorframe. "It's them." The riders stopped 20 yards from the house. Their horses snorted, breath steaming. The man in front, a burly fellow with a scar down his cheek, tipped his hat, though there was no courtesy in the gesture. "Afternoon, ladies," he said, his voice thick with whiskey and confidence. "Looks like you've had yourselves a cozy winter." Louisa didn't move. Talon stood beside her, the axe still in his hand, not raised but not resting either. "What do you want?" Louisa asked. The man smiled. "Just visiting an old acquaintance." His gaze slid toward Millie. "Ain't that right, sweetheart?" Millie's breath hitched. I paid you what I could." "Not near enough," another man said, a thin one with a yellowed grin. "Your luck ran out, darlin'. Time to pay the rest." Louisa stepped forward, anger flaring hotter than fear. "She doesn't owe you a damn thing. You'll turn those horses around and leave." Scarface chuckled. "We got papers, ma'am. Debt's debt. Her name's on it. Ours to collect. Unless you're aiming to buy her freedom yourself." Talon shifted slightly, his dark eyes steady. "You've said enough." The men's eyes flicked toward him, confusion turning to sneers. "Well, hell," the thin man said. "You picked yourself a new protector, Millie, half-breed and all?" Talon didn't move, but his grip tightened on the axe handle. "You best leave." Scarface spat into the snow. "We don't take orders from your kind." He turned his horse slightly, reaching toward the rifle slung across his saddle. Louisa's voice cut through the tension. "There's a child inside." "Not our concern," the man said. "We came for what's owed." Talon's voice dropped low, quiet as thunder before a storm. "You take one more step toward this house, and you'll answer to me." The words hung in the air like smoke. For a moment, no one breathed. Then the scarred man laughed. "Big talk, Apache." He swung his leg to dismount. The axe left Talon's hand before Louisa even realized he'd moved. It buried in the snow at the horse's feet, a clean, deliberate strike that sent the animal rearing. The man cursed, yanking at the reins, barely keeping his seat. Talon stood calm, eyes never leaving theirs. "Next one won't miss." The 3 riders hesitated, anger battling caution. The thin one muttered, "Ain't worth it. We can come back with more." Scarface glared at Louisa, then at Millie. "You hear that? We'll be back. And we won't be asking polite." They turned their horses and rode off, snow spraying beneath the hooves. The sound faded slow, leaving only the creak of trees and the wild hammering of Louisa's pulse. When silence returned, Louisa turned on Millie. "You told me they were just gamblers. You didn't say they had a claim on you." Millie sank onto the porch steps, face buried in her hands. "It wasn't supposed to follow me here." "What did you do, Millie?" Her voice broke. "I forged his name, Jack's. After he died, I tried to pay the doctor, the rent, everything. I thought I could win it back, but I lost. I lost everything." She lifted her head, tears streaking her cheeks. I never meant for you to be part of this." Louisa stared at her, the anger in her chest twisting into something heavier. "You're my sister. That means I'm part of it, whether I like it or not." Behind them, Talon picked up the axe and carried it to the shed. His movements were calm, controlled, but his jaw was tight. "You should leave before they return," he said. "They'll bring more men." "I won't run from them," Louisa said. He met her eyes. "They'll come to kill. Then they'll have to try." For a moment, they stood like that, two stubborn souls facing the same storm. Then Talon nodded. "I'll make ready." He spent the afternoon preparing. He checked the rifle, cut new shafts for arrows, repaired the barn door so it could bar from inside. Louisa worked beside him, her hands steady, despite the fear gnawing under her ribs. That night, they sat by the fire, Rose sleeping soundly in her cradle. The light painted the cabin in odd and shadow. Millie rocked back and forth near the hearth, whispering to herself. "Talon," Louisa said softly, "why'd you stay? You could have gone when the snow melted." He looked into the fire. "Because I've seen what happens when men like that take what they want. I won't see it again." Louisa studied him, the lines of his face caught between flame and darkness. "You'll risk your life for people you barely know." He turned to her then. "You saved mine. That's enough." She didn't answer, but something in her eyes softened, an unspoken thanks. The next day broke clear and cold. Frost glistened on every branch, and the valley lay still, as if holding its breath. Louisa was in the barn feeding the horses when she heard it, a distant rumble. Hooves again. Many this time. "Talon!" she shouted. He was already at the door, rifle in hand. Through the glare of sun on snow, shapes appeared, 4 riders this time, not 3. The same men, and more with them. They were coming fast. Louisa's heart slammed against her ribs. She glanced toward the cabin, where Millie and the baby waited. Talon's voice was calm. "Take them to the cellar. Bar the hatch. I'm not leaving you." He gave her a quick look, something fierce and tender all at once. "You will if you want that child to live." Louisa hesitated, then nodded. She ran back inside, grabbed Millie by the shoulders. "Downstairs now." Millie clutched Rose and obeyed, vanishing below the trapdoor beneath the rug. Louisa dropped the latch and turned back, toward the window just as the first gunshot split the air. The sound was deafening. Glass shattered. She ducked low, heart pounding. Outside, Talon moved through the smoke like he'd done it all his life. Calm, precise, ghost quiet. He fired once, twice. One man fell from his saddle. The others scattered, shouting. Louisa grabbed her father's old rifle and joined him by the doorway. "You said I could shoot better than you," she called. He glanced at her, a flash of pride in his eyes. "Then prove it." The fight didn't last long. The men weren't used to being fought. When one horse went down and another rider fell, clutching his arm, the rest broke and might, cursing into the trees. When the last echo faded, the world went still again. Only the hiss of gun smoke lingered, curling into the cold air. Louisa lowered her rifle, her hands shaking. Talon stepped beside her, scanning the horizon. "They'll not be back soon," he said. "Not after Tizzy." She looked at him, at the line of blood running down his temple, where a splinter of wood had caught him. "You're hurt." "It's nothing." She reached up, brushed the blood away with her thumb. He didn't flinch. "Why?" she whispered. "Why risk it?" He met her gaze. "Because no one should have to fight alone." Louisa's breath caught. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, a sound came from behind, a cry. "Millie." They rushed inside. The cellar hatch stood open. Millie knelt on the floor, pale, one hand pressed to her side. Blood seeped through her fingers. "I'm sorry," she breathed. "I tried to help." One of them he got in through the back window. I—" Her voice faltered. Louisa fell beside her, catching her sister's hand. "No, Millie. Stay with me. Please." Millie's eyes drifted toward Rose, who whimpered softly in the cradle. "Promise me, you'll keep her safe. Don't let her carry my shame." Louisa's throat closed. "You'll tell her yourself." Millie smiled faintly. "You were always stronger, Louisa." Her hand went slack. The world seemed to shrink to the sound of the wind outside, the fire's low crackle, and the child's fragile breathing. Louisa bowed her head, tears burning her cheeks. Talon stood behind her, silent. "After a long time," he said softly, "she found her peace. Now we find yours." Louisa lifted her gaze. His eyes met hers, steady, sorrowful, certain. For the first time in years, she didn't feel alone in her grief. The wind rose again that night, hollow and wide, sweeping through the valley like it carried the voices of the dead. Louisa sat beside the hearth, her hands folded in her lap, the firelight flickering against her pale face. The smell of gunpowder still hung faintly in the air. The floorboards near the cellar were scrubbed clean, but no amount of soap could wash away what had happened there. Millie was gone, buried by the creek that afternoon, beneath a young pine. The ground was half frozen, and every stroke of the shovel had bitten through both ice and heart. Louisa had worked until her hands bled. She'd made the cross herself, carved with her father's old knife. Millie Harlow. She found peace in the snow. Now the house was too quiet. Rose slept soundly in her cradle, her small breaths rising and falling like the tide. Talon sat across from Louisa, sharpening his knife by the dim light. The rasp of stone against steel was steady, almost comforting. Louisa stared into the fire until her eyes blurred. "I never told her I forgave her," she said finally. Talon didn't look up. "She knew." "She didn't," Louisa said, voice trembling. "We spent half our lives trying to prove the other wrong. And when she needed me most, I was too busy judging her." He set the knife down gently. "You did what you could." "I should have protected her," she whispered. "She came here because she thought I was strong. But I wasn't." Talon leaned forward, his dark eyes soft in the firelight. "Strength isn't always loud, Louisa. Sometimes it's just standing back up when the world tells you to stay down." Her gaze met his. The silence between them was heavy, but not suffocating. Outside, the storm moaned against the walls, rattling the windows like a restless spirit. "I buried her next to Ma and Pa," Louisa said. "It's the only place that ever forgave me." Talon rose slowly, his movements quiet. He took something from his pocket, a small strip of leather, worn smooth with age, strung with a carved bead the color of smoke. He held it out to her. "This belonged to my wife," he said. "She made it when our son was born. I kept it too long, holding on to ghosts that don't answer back. Maybe it belongs with Rose now." Louisa hesitated. "I can't take this from you." "You're not," he said. "You're keeping her memory alive, and maybe giving mine a place to rest." He placed it gently in her hand. Louisa turned it over in the light. The bead glowed faintly amber, warm as the fire. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "She was," he said softly. The fire cracked, and for a moment neither spoke. The world outside the cabin could have been gone for all they knew. There was only the steady rhythm of Rose's breathing, the faint whistle of wind through the chimney, and the thrum of two hearts learning how to beat in the same quiet room. The next morning dawned gray, but calm. The storm had passed, leaving the valley blanketed in pale stillness. Louisa stood by the window, watching the smoke from the chimney rise straight into the sky. Behind her, Talon set a kettle on the fire. "You should rest," he said. "I can't," she replied. "There is too much to do." He smiled faintly. "You're like the mountain, never still." Louisa turned toward him, weary but curious. And you? What are you then? He shrugged. Wind, maybe. Always moving. Sometimes gentle. Sometimes not. The faintest smile touched her lips. You don't seem like a man who stays in one place. He met her gaze. Until now, I wasn't. Something warm flickered in her chest, a pulse of feeling she hadn't known in years. She turned back to the window before it could show on her face. They spent the day in quiet work. Talon mended the barn door and stacked what was left of the firewood. Louisa scrubbed the floors, fed the animals, and kept the stove burning. The rhythm of chores steadied her hands, if not her heart. When evening came, they ate together in silence. The baby stirred now and then, fussing softly, but Talon soothed her with the low hum of a song in his language. Louisa didn't understand the words, but the sound wrapped around the room like smoke. When he finished, she said, "What does it mean?" He smiled a little. "It's for children who are afraid of thunder. It says the storm will pass, and what's meant to stay will stay." Louisa nodded, her throat tight. She seems to like it. Most children do. They know when a heart means what it sings. Louisa looked down at Rose's small hand curled around her finger. "I don't know if I can raise her," she said quietly. "I'm not her mother." "You're all she has," Talon said, "and she's all you have left. Sometimes that's enough to start again." She lifted her eyes to him. "And you? What do you have left?" He paused, then said simply, "This place. The fire. You." Her breath caught. He didn't move closer, didn't reach for her, just looked at her as if saying her name silently. The space between them was a single heartbeat wide. Louisa turned away first. "I'll fetch more water before dark," she murmured. Talon didn't stop her, but as she stepped outside, she heard him whisper something low, a word she couldn't quite catch. Later, she would remember the sound of it, soft, reverent, like a prayer carried by the wind. That night, after Rose was asleep, Louisa sat by the fire with the little wooden bird Talon had carved weeks ago. Its wings were open, as if ready to take flight. She ran her thumb along its smooth back, thinking of all the things she'd built her life around: walls, fences, silence. Talon came to sit across from her, the shadows of flame dancing on his face. "Sometimes I think this land feeds on sorrow," she said quietly. "You bury enough of it, it starts to bloom." Talon nodded. "Sorrow's what makes things grow. That's the secret the mountains keep." Louisa glanced at him, her eyes tired but alive. "You talk like a preacher." He smiled. "I'm no preacher, just a man who's seen what fire can destroy and what it can leave behind." She studied him for a moment, then asked, "And what did it leave you?" He met her gaze. "You. The chance to stop running." The words were simple, but they sank deep. Louisa felt something loosen inside her, like the first crack in a thawing river. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for his hand, her fingers trembling slightly. He let her take it. His skin was rough, warm, alive. For the first time in years, Louisa allowed herself to rest her head on someone's shoulder. The firelight flickered against the walls, catching the grain of the wood, the curve of her cheek, the glint of his eyes. They stayed like that for a long time. No words, no promise. Just the slow, steady rhythm of two people who had lost everything and somehow, against all reason, found each other among the ashes. Near midnight, Louisa stirred. "When spring comes," she said softly, "I'll build a new cradle for her, and maybe plant something by the creek." Talon's voice was low, almost a whisper. "What would you plant?" "Something that survives the cold," she said. "Maybe a pine, maybe a wild rose." He smiled. "Both are stubborn things. They'd suit you." Louisa lifted her head, looked at him in the firelight. "Maybe they'd suit us." For a moment, he didn't answer. Then he reached up, brushed a strand of hair from her face, his hand trembling slightly. Then we'll plant them together. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines. Inside, the fire burned low but steady. Louisa turned her hand over and found the strip of leather he'd given her still there, warm against her skin. She looped it around her wrist and whispered, "You said the storm would pass." Talon nodded. It did. And for the first time in years, she believed it. It closes the story with tenderness and quiet hope, a portrait of healing, legacy, and the family that rose from loss. 3 years passed, and the snows of Bitterroot Valley came and went like breathing. The seasons moved in quiet circles, frost to thaw, thaw to bloom, and life returned to the land that once held only silence. On a bright morning in late spring, the creek ran high with meltwater, whispering through the rocks behind the cabin. Louisa stood by the window, sleeves rolled up, flour on her hands, the smell of baking bread filling the room. Her dark hair had silvered a little, but her eyes were steady, alive. Outside, the sun poured through the pines. A small figure darted between the fence posts. Rose, now 3 years old, her laugh ringing across the yard like birdsong. She chased a butterfly that bobbed and weaved through the air, her bare feet leaving prints in the soft earth. "Careful, little one," Louisa called from the doorway. "You'll scare it off." Rose turned, cheeks flushed, curls tumbling over her face. "It likes me, Mama. It's following me." Louisa smiled. The word Mama still caught her heart every time she heard it. It wasn't one she'd claimed for herself, but the child had given it to her freely, and she couldn't bear to correct her. Behind the barn, Talon's voice called out, a calm baritone carried on the wind. "Rose, come help me with the sapling." Rose squealed and ran toward him, her little arms pumping. Louisa stepped onto the porch, shading her eyes against the light. Talon stood near the fence, a spade in one hand, a small pine sapling in the other. The sunlight caught in his hair, turning it copper at the edges. His shoulders were broader now, his movements slower, steadier, like a man who had found his place in the world and no longer needed to fight it. "You sure it'll grow there?" Louisa asked, walking toward him. He smiled. "The ground's soft. The creek will feed it. It'll stand long after we're gone." Rose tugged on his pant leg. "Can I help dig, Papa?" "Of course," he said, handing her the small trowel he'd carved from deer antler. Louisa watched as Rose crouched beside him, tongue between her teeth in concentration, scooping soil into a neat pile. Talon steadied the sapling while she worked. "What kind of tree is it?" Rose asked. Talon brushed a bit of dirt from his hand. "A pine, little one. The kind that keeps its color when the snow comes." Louisa joined them, kneeling in the grass. "Strong and stubborn," she said, "just like your father." Talon looked at her, amused. "And your mother," he added. Rose laughed, though she didn't quite understand, and the sound was so pure it made Louisa's eyes sting. Together they planted the tree, their hands moving in rhythm 3 sets, large and small, working the soil around the roots until it stood upright. Green against the sky, Talon pressed the earth firm with his palms, then sat back on his heels. "There," he said softly. "That'll do." Louisa dusted her hands, watching the sapling sway in the light breeze. "You never told me why you chose a pine." He looked at the creek, where the water glimmered like glass. "Because it survives," he said. "No matter the wind, no matter the cold, it holds fast. Reminds us that some things don't die easy." Louisa reached out, brushing a speck of dirt from his cheek. "Then it's the right tree for this family." Talon caught her hand, pressed it lightly to his lips. "For us," he said. That afternoon, they laid a small bouquet of wildflowers beneath the pine. Louisa had picked them herself from the meadow violets, prairie crocus, and a single pale blossom of bitterroot. She placed them gently on the ground, whispering a name only the wind could hear. "Millie." Rose knelt beside her, curious. "Mama, who's the flowers for?" Louisa smiled faintly. "For someone we loved very much." "Are they in the sky now?" Louisa nodded. "Yes, sweetheart. But when we plant things and they grow, it's like they are still here, watching." Rose's eyes widened. "Then she'll see the tree." "She will," Louisa said softly. Talon stood a few steps away, head bowed. When the wind stirred the branches, he murmured a few words in Apache, a blessing for the dead and for those who lived on. Louisa didn't know the meaning, but the sound was enough. It carried peace. As the day lengthened, Louisa and Talon worked side by side, fixing the fence and tending the small garden near the porch. The air smelled of earth and lilac. Every so often, Rose's laughter drifted from the yard, chasing chickens or calling out to the creek. It was a good kind of noise, Louisa thought, the kind that filled a house instead of haunting it. When the chores were done, they sat together on the porch steps. Talon handed her a tin cup of coffee, steam curling up into the cooling air. 3 years, Louisa said, watching the sun sink behind the ridge. Feels like another lifetime. Talon nodded. Maybe it is. She studied him. Do you ever think about leaving? Going back south? He shook his head. No. My people are gone, scattered. The only home I have now is where you are. Louisa looked toward the little pine. Its needles shivered in the evening wind, bright and alive. Home, she repeated, as if testing the word on her tongue. It still sounds strange. Talon smiled. You'll get used to it. Later, after Rose was asleep, Louisa stood at the doorway watching her. The child slept curled against a small quilt Louisa had sewn that first winter after Millie died. The strip of leather Talon had given her years ago now hung over Rose's bedpost, the bead catching the lamplight. Louisa felt Talon's arms slide around her waist from behind. His chin rested lightly against her shoulder. She dreams easy, he said. She's never known the world we did, Louisa replied. Then we did right. She turned to face him, their eyes level in the dim light. You think we've earned peace? He smiled faintly. No one earns it. We just choose it every day. Louisa nodded. Then I'll keep choosing. He kissed her forehead, slow and gentle. So will I. The night settled around them, soft and quiet. Outside, the pine tree stood by the creek, its slender shape framed by stars. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wet earth and new growth. Somewhere an owl called, and the sound echoed through the valley. Louisa and Talon sat on the porch, wrapped in a wool blanket, watching the moon climb above the ridge. I've been thinking, she said after a while, about carving something into the beam above the hearth. A name. He looked at her, curious. What name? She smiled. Ours. So she'll know where she comes from. He nodded. Do it. The next morning, when the sun broke through the trees, Louisa took her father's knife and carved 3 words into the wood above the fireplace. Louisa. Talon. Rose. The letters were rough, uneven, but deep cut straight into the grain, meant to last. When she finished, she stepped back, wiping the dust from her hands. The morning light caught the carvings, making them glow like gold. Talon came up behind her, resting a hand on her shoulder. Rose toddled in, carrying the small pine carving of the bird that had once sat on the mantel. Mama, she said, holding it up. Bird wants to fly again. Louisa smiled. Then let's put it by the window, so it can see the tree. They placed it together on the sill, wings open toward the world. Outside, the young pine bent in the breeze, sunlight glittering along its needles. The creek sang softly nearby. Louisa stood beside Talon, her hand finding his. Do you think she'd be proud? She asked. He squeezed her fingers. She'd see that from the ashes, something good took root. That's enough for any soul. Louisa looked at the tree again. the tiny shadow it cast across the grass, and felt the weight of all the winters she'd survived lift from her chest. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the valley, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers. The mountains shone pink in the distance, touched by the setting sun. And in that quiet light, the family they'd built, born not of blood, but of choice, stood together, whole. No ghosts left to chase, no past left to outrun. Just the sound of water, the promise of spring, and a tree that would stand as long as love allowed.